act, we create a space with clients of openness, awareness, engagement, a space for values, and willing encourages vulnerability. I was wondering if polyvagal theory can be related in any way to creating this kind of space with clients.
Well, the space with a client is co-regulation, and that is this communication of cues of safety and creating a reciprocal cueing back from the client. So the space with the client, when the ACT therapist knows they've created the space, how do you know? You're getting some cues back, right? And you're in a sense, you're in that dyad, the interactive unit with the client to create a co-regulatory unit of trust and safety. And that becomes the basis for the expansion of the therapy.
Thank you so much. This is really mind-opening. My next question could be a little bit more technical. What is the state of evidence of polyvagal theory?
Well, okay, so you have to separate the question of evidence from what is theory and what is not theory. So theory is really the application in applied areas. So it says that if this roadmap of physiology relates to, let's say, psychopathology, then this is what should occur. So the actual neurophysiology has not been effectively criticized. There have been criticisms, I don't question that, but the criticisms have not been of the theory. They've been a misunderstanding of a theory. And to me, this has been very disappointing. I wanted criticisms to refine the theory. I didn't want to waste my time arguing about ancient vertebrate who might have nerves that look similar to mammals, because it's not our phylogenetic heritage. The theory said it's the change from that asocial reptile to the social mammal, which is where the information is. And the part is, it's not how we're similar with reptiles, it's how we're different. And so the evidence not just suggests, documents that with the mammal we have a tool to turn off our threat reactions. The reptile did not. So mammals, how do they turn off threat? Through social interaction. This is critical. How did they turn it off? It wasn't through a behavioral model of social interaction. It was through a neurophysiological model of cues of safety, which operationally were defined by changing the physiological state of the other. So it's a tight loop. So that evidence is strong in terms of the neurophysiology. And there are something like 14,000 publications and peer-reviewed articles that have used polyvagal theory to support their findings. So you start seeing this enormous wealth of studies. In my own work, what I'm focusing on is the quantification of autonomic state as an intervening variable that makes predictions about outcomes. And I see that as important. And the interesting studies that we have recently published are, how do people respond to the pandemic? Well, even we were using a survey tool called the Body Perception Questionnaire, which is not only translated in Italian, but it's also a publication on the factor analysis of the Italian version. And what it does is it enables a clinician to measure autonomic reactivity through a set of questions. And when you use that, you find out that autonomic reactivity maps into adversity history. But now it gets interesting. So you say, oh, sure, if you have adversity history, you're more autonomically reactive, more atypical in your autonomic nervous system. Fits polyvagal theory. It says we got stuck in the wrong state with adversity. But it tells you one thing more. When you start making predictions, like who are the people during the pandemic who did not get infected but had mental health outcome problems, it is virtually all the predictability of adversity history, which is related to those clinical things, is mediated through its relationship with autonomic reactivity. So autonomic reactivity is that intervening variable. So trauma history is important, but it's only really in the model, its great importance is that it has retuned the autonomic nervous system into a state of defense. Then you get the poor outcomes. In the study of about 2,000 people, we had about 100 who got COVID. And this was very early during the pandemic. And to my surprise, the adversity history predicted who got COVID. So if they had a high adversity history, over 75% got COVID. If they had a low one, it was close to zero. But that was early in the pandemic, and with the different variants, the numbers would change over time. But the point I'm making is adversity history is a pre-existing condition that can be redefined and refined if you have a measure of autonomic regulation. So that becomes important. And something, we did a study a few years ago looking at adversity history, autonomic regulation with the survey, and human sexual behavior, whether individuals had, in a sense, enjoyed sex or had sexual problems, males and females. Same story. You think that trauma creates the problem? No, trauma does if it retunes autonomic nervous system. And we recently did another study with college students looking at maltreatment history, not PTSD, but maltreatment. Nothing, I would say nothing real severe, not severe on the questionnaires, but it told us enough that if they had, and we measured autonomic regulation, if the autonomic regulation was challenged, their autonomic reactions, their physiological reactions to both physical and psychological challenges were different. So you start seeing that and this goes into other concepts like psychological flexibility, because underlying psychological flexibility is a neurophysiological flexibility. And there's a construct that I developed called vagal efficiency, which is really telling the clinician or the scientist how responsive is that vagal system to demands. And even demands like exercise bike, does it recover? Posture shifts, what happens when you move posture shifts? Does it systematically regulate your heart rate to deal with those demands? Or is it unpredictable? And so the more systematic of it would be called, you have a vagally efficient one, which says, I need to move. The vagal brake gets pulled off. I now have more metabolic activity. I now sit down. The brake comes back on. I'm calm. I don't need my sympathetic nervous system to do very much because I just pull the brake off. I don't need to step on the gas. And now I'm a regulated, calm person. To me, that concept of vagal efficiency is underlying what psychological flexibility is. It's saying I can navigate through this world. I can recruit metabolic resources to get the hell out of places. But, when I get into a safe place, I sit down, whoosh, I'm back.
Thank you. I love speaking about values. So, one personal question is, which are the values that led you to your work and to your theory?
We're all on our own personal journeys, okay? I was always curious. Okay, so you have to go back in time. And as I was saying while we were having coffee, there's certain advantages for being around a long time, even though we may always think of ourselves as youth and coming into science at different times. I came into science, or at least the science of psychology and the neurobiology of behavior, when it was a very atheoretical and very empirical science. People were not making inferences, and there was very little integration with physiology. In fact, when I started, I was very intrigued with something called psychophysiology. But psychophysiology was basically treating physiology as if it were a behavior. So what it did was create psychophysiological parallelism. If I can get an electrode on it and get a measure, I can observe it, and then I can see how it works according to the laws of learning. So this was when people were trying to operantly condition heart rate and blood pressure, and the work got kind of convoluted, and they could mediate it reliably, and that became biofeedback and neurofeedback. but the actual documentation of independent conditioning of autonomic reactions using operant technology was never replicated, even though it was thought to be really excitement because it was going to now integrate operant and classical type conditioning, a one form of learning model. It was very naive because it didn't incorporate the neurophysiology of what we view as conditioned responses. And it really, if you go back in retrospect, you say, how naive could my heroes have been? Yeah. So the issue is all you need to do is look at how that autonomic nervous system is wired and realizing that you're dealing with three different branches. You're dealing with a subdiaphragmatic, classically conditioned primary system, which is very ancient. You're dealing with a spinal skeletal sympathetic mobilization system, which is really home for operant control. And then you're dealing with a cranial system, which is the part I love because of the face, the voice, and even listening, and breath. And that follows some other rules. So the issue is not that rules of association can't be used, because they can become top-down regulators of these foundational brainstem structures. But so I was interested in, now to make the long story short, I was interested in, actually I would say, what is it good that's going on? What are people thinking about without having to ask them a word? What can you extract from physiology without having to use verbal intention or verbal words? I was very concerned about what people would say versus what really was going on. Of course, when you're in a culture that says you should treat people nicely, you should, is that person really nice, or is that person just saying things? So I had those types of, I would say adolescent curiosity. The real breakthrough in polyvagal theory came in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I was working with preterm babies. And I was studying the heart rate patterns of them, trying to develop a technology to detect risk in preterm babies, actually in fetuses as well, because I thought that if you could see the deterioration of the neural regulation, you could intervene, because it really was telling you that they were becoming hypoxic, not enough oxygen. And so I started to measure heart rate patterns. I had been measuring heart rate variability since 1966, actually. So I actually was the first to quantify heart rate variability. And it's been interesting to watch where that has gone. But that journey led me into a refinement of heart rate variability to extract neural influences and not just physiology. I felt the secret was, can I measure a specific neural function? And that's where the vagus and vagal activity came. That's where polyvagal came from. So by the early 1990s, late 1980s, I was studying the preterm babies, and I noticed something, that the beat-to-beat heart rate, the respiratory rhythm, which I had always talked about and written about as being very positive, and assumed it was vagal because that's what the literature taught me, it was basically babies who had that were doing really well. But babies, when they lost the beat-to-beat heart rate, their heart rates went faster, loss of the vagal regulation, and they started to lose oxygenization. Then their heart rate would plummet with what's called a bradycardia, massive slowing. But that was also considered vagal. And so now I'm in this quandary. How can the vagus, when it's showing these nice respiratory rhythms, be positive, but the vagus, when it's showing these decelerations, be lethal? How can it be the same nerve? And this got me into understanding what is the vagus. So I had to now reconceptualize, and this is, I think, most people who think of heart rate variability in vagus think of this empowerment of a nerve. And it's, in a sense, a false flag, it's a misdirection. Because the nerve's not doing anything, the nerve is carrying fibers. And these fibers do different things. So the answer to what I call the vagal paradox was, really, there's more than one vagus. There's many different pathways in this complex nerve. And we were, again, naive. We're thinking that the nerve is doing the work. The nerve is connecting the brainstem with the bodily organs. And not only that, most of the fibers in the vagus are literally a surveillance system projecting bodily feelings to the brainstem, or bodily status, or organ status. And so 80% of the fibers are surveillance or monitoring fibers. That's why feelings are so important. They totally change what's going on above that brainstem. But the motor system going down have two different sources. One is a newer mammalian one that is regulated in a ventral area of the brainstem, this forefront, and the other one's this ancient one in the dorsal pole. And they're very different. And their evolutionary history is a history that is an interesting story. So you have this back of the brainstem, dorsal vagal area that is really shared with every vertebrate, virtually every vertebrate. Something happens in this transition from ancient reptiles to modern mammals. Some of those cardioinhibitory fibers, those that slow the heart of that vagal area, go for a journey. They go for a walkabout. They go out and they start moving ventrally to an area of the brainstem that regulates the face. And they get intertwined and start talking to each other. And that area of the face now enables our vocalizations to convey the physiological state of those calming cardioinhibitory vagal fibers. So our prosody, our voice, is telling you and me that we're safe to come close to each other. And then when the face smiles, and you have that, we're broadcasting that we're safe to come close to. And on top of that, it's controlling the middle ear structures, so now I can hear your voice better. And even more interesting than that is the area of the brainstem that has the sensory information from the facial muscles, the trigeminal, the oral motor muscles, even muscles in the middle ear. They're getting sensory information that is bombarding the area of the brainstem that controls the cardiac inhibitory vagus. So when we listen to, let's say, maternal lullabies or soft music where we feel safe and calm, the muscles in the middle ear are contracting, and that's changing how tense the eardrum is, like a kettle drum. And guess what's embedded in the eardrum? Sensory fibers from the trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves, going back to that area. So it's telling them you're calm. So listening on many levels makes us feel better. And in fact, listening becomes a neuromodulator of our calming vagus.
Thank you so much. And are you working on listening interventions too?
Yeah, well, we developed an intervention called the Safe and Sound Protocol. And now something like 3,000 therapists are using it, but I think about 4 have been trained. It's out of my hand. It's licensed to a company, and several. I know there's over 100,000 people have been affected by it, which is, makes me feel great. But it started off with focusing on children who had hyperactivity and autism, meaning that they had state regulation issues. And this worked very well because it calmed them down. And it did a couple other things. It reduced auditory hypersensitivities and improved their ability to extract human speech so they could learn to speak. And I would talk about this in this journey into the world of trauma. And the trauma therapists for over a decade were hearing me talk about this and say, And they said, where can I get this? I said, nah, if you're asking that question, you're asking the wrong question. What you should be asking is, how can I embed these principles in how I am a therapist? Well, once it went commercial, the trauma therapists grabbed it. And what they taught me was something amazing. So they tried it with people, and they start getting what I would call as effects that would really bother me. So what was happening is that if you have a trauma history and you listen to this music, suddenly your defenses go like this, and you become accessible. Now the interoception, the feeling of bodily safety, goes up interoceptively, and now your aware brain says, don't like that. I'm not just accessible, I'm vulnerable. And this would literally trigger a destabilization and a reactivity. Now, the trauma therapists, I would say in this case, were smarter than me. My feeling was, I don't want to hurt anyone. Take it, don't use it that way. Kid's fine, be careful with what you're doing. They started to figure out how to make it work. And it was through titration, allowing people to feel their body for short periods of time. So rather than a half hour or an hour session, it could be a minute or two. And they could feel it. And then they could resolve it, go back, feel it again. And then their bodies would start to become more accustomed. So now it becomes top down, where the bottom up is triggering, now the top down says, not so bad. And this is, we go back to where we start the conversation. This is acceptance. What the person's doing is they're accepting that bodily feeling and not fighting it. And so now what had been associated with a trauma or threat is now just a feeling. It has no power unto itself.
Thank you so much. I don't know if there is something else you would like to add or share with someone who can look at you as a model to be inspired by.
Well, okay, so thank you. I think what you want to look at is not to me, but you need to look at some of the things I've written, because I've been trying. My journey is to translate the ideas into the world that you're in. So I'm working hard. I wrote 2 papers this past year. One is really about the phylogenetic heritage of sociality, and the other one is a science of safety. And you can find these papers. You just do Google Scholar. They're both open access. Or you can look on my, actually I think Polyvagal Institute website would have my bibliography on it as well. But I think what we start to learn is that our journey is not through invention. Our journey is through understanding who we are. And respecting, really respecting the tools that are on board within our body. And so once we acknowledge that we have this wonderful gift of turning off our own threat reactions, they can be turned off. We start to enable people to use them through social relationships, through identifying appropriately trusting people. So it's not like any person I'm going to engage. It's very dangerous, and your nervous system knows that. But we start to respect. And again, I think about the survivors of trauma, who in their mind, they've lived such, let's say, devastating lives where trust was violated, even by, let's say, parents. I mean, to such an extreme, it's hard to believe. Yet, they still have this dream, this visualization of being safe in the arms of another. So their body hasn't given up the motivation of feeling safe. They just haven't navigated to it. And what we want to be able to do is enable these people to have that experience.
So thank you so much, Steve, for your time and this interview and your amazing work. It was a real pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you, but let me give the final word. We're all on our own personal journeys, and to have a personal journey that has discovery and application and acceptance by others is a rare gift. So I have this tremendous sense of gratitude, because as an academic, there's one thing that I knew about being an academic, and that was I knew and know frustration. And frustration is when your ideas are not available to others. And for me, what a gift. I mean, what I'm really saying is that what more would one want? I mean, it's certainly material gain is irrelevant. What you want is to, as we use words like make a difference, but what we really want to do is have an understanding of who we are as humans and to share that understanding with others. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for watching this.